Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Laravel Worldwide Meetup, the 5th edition. As you can see, I have a guest with me. The first talk will be by Ryan Chandler, and later on this meetup, we'll have a second talk by Liam. But let's start with Ryan first. Hello, man. How are you doing?
Yeah, not bad. How are you?
I had a very good day. The only downside that I had was struggling with some GitHub actions, so I hope to learn from you a little bit.
Yeah,
Now,
hopefully.
now, Ryan, I've seen you been very active with Laravel, with Livewire and Alpine as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
You're using those two tools for a lot of your development as well.
yeah. Mostly tool stack stuff now. Yeah, Alpine, Livewire,
Yeah,
yeah,
cool,
sort of
man.
stack. Yeah,
But originally you were going to talk about those, but you changed your mind, and we're going to talk about the GitHub Actions now, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was going to do a talk on some of the tool stack stuff, but yeah, I figure this is a little bit different.
Okay.
Yeah, might help some people out.
Okay. I'd say the floor is yours. Take it away for GitHub Actions.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just share my screen quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, can we see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, welcome to my talk presentation. I'm going to be talking about GitHub Actions, specifically for Laravel developers. A little bit about me. I'm a Laravel and JavaScript developer by day, by night. You might know me for Alpine, the tool preset, which I developed with Liam and Dan Harrin as well. Or you might know me for some Spruce, which is my global state management library for Alpine. You might also know me for my Unconventional Laravel blog series, where I write about some cool and interesting stuff that you can do with Laravel. So I'm going to start off simple with GitHub Actions itself. What is GitHub Actions? So it's a first-class CI/CD platform for repositories hosted on GitHub, and it's free for public repos. So a lot of open source packages, Sparsy's packages as well, they use GitHub Actions for their CI. And it doesn't have any runtime limits or anything like that for public repos. And it's got quite a generous quota for private repos as well. So I think the base plan, you get 2,000 minutes for free per month on private repos. If you pay for a GitHub plan, you get a few more minutes. I think it's up 3,000 for the next plan up. How does it work? So the process for getting GitHub Actions is actually quite simple. So these are the basic steps. You enable actions on your repo. You then create a new workflow, which is where you define all of your actions. It's the pipelines for the CI/CD itself. You set up some triggers for your workflow. So you say when the workflow is going to run, and then you add these actions to your workflow. So I'm going to be going over Laravel applications in particular. So from an application standpoint, not packages. And the steps for this are going to be quite simple as well. We're going to start by setting up some PHP and the extensions that Laravel requires. We're going to install Composer dependencies. We're going to run our test suite, which is just a basic PHP unit test suite. And then we're going to look at how we can get notifications for our test suite as well. So let me just switch over here. So I've got a GitHub repo here, and I'm just going to head over to the settings tab. I'll make this repository available after the talk as well. And I'm just going to click down on this actions tab on the left-hand side here. So you can see I've already got actions enabled, but in some cases you might not. It might be allow select actions or disable actions. So the first thing you're going to want to do is click this allow all actions one. And I'm just going to hit save. And now if I switch over to my VS Code setup, I'm just going to hide this little thing down here. I've just got a very basic vanilla Laravel application. I've not installed any packages. I've not really done anything. And I've got some tests here. So these are the tests that come out of the box with Laravel. So I've got this unit test here and this feature test as well. And now if I open a terminal We're going to be using PHP Artisan Test to run this test suite. It's just a pretty version of PHP Unit. You could also, run PHP Unit itself, but we're going to stick with PHP Artisan Test. So the first step, I enabled GitHub Actions on the repo, and the next thing I'm going to do is create this sort of magic folder called .github. And GitHub's going to use this folder to look for any repository-specific files, such as workflows. So I'm then going to create a subfolder here called workflows. And this is where we're going to be putting all of our YAML files. Now, GitHub Actions uses YAML. It's quite a simple syntax, I think. It did use a different syntax in the past that I found sort of confusing at first glance. But we use YAML for a lot of things these days, like style CI and stuff like that. So I'm going to create a new file here, and I'm going to be running tests specifically. So why don't we call this file tests.yaml. And this is where we're going to define all of our actions. And I'm just going to pull up my notes to the side here so that we can get started.
Ryan, could you make it a little bit bigger, the font? So
yeah,
for some people, it's a little bit small.
Is that
Thanks,
big
man.
enough?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Cool.
Thanks, man.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is define a name for our workflow. And we just do that with a name key here. So I'm going to be quite specific here. I'm going to be calling this run PHP unit suite. We can see this here. So if you're using VS Code, there's actually an extension that you can install as well, which is why I've got all of this linting and this sort of error notices here. So you can see it says that we're missing the property on. Let's talk about the on property for a second. The on property is going to be used to describe what triggers our workflow will listen for. So you might have push, you might have pull request, you could even have releases. So you run some workflows on release or on tag. We're going to be using just push for this example. The next key here is missing property jobs. So let's just define this jobs property. And now this is where we're going to define each of our workflow steps, or each of our workflows jobs, as it is so aptly named. So let's start with one called tests. This is now where we're going to add all of our actions. So we're going to start off by saying what the name for this step is. So let's just call run PHP unit suite again. And we now need to say what OS it runs on. Just start with Ubuntu, which is probably what you're going to be running most of your tests on, especially if you're deploying to an Ubuntu server. If you're using Windows Server or you want to test on Mac, you can also say Windows latest or Mac OS latest. But we're going to stick with Ubuntu for now. This is it. This is like the basic carcass of a workflow file. If we want to go any further, though, we need to get access to our code. We need to check out our repository. So we can add another step down here. Let's add a steps key. And this is now where we'll add each individual action and its configuration. So let's create our first step. So I'm going to call this checkout code. And this name is what you'll see inside of the actions tab on GitHub itself. It will describe what step you're in. There's another property here that we can use called users. And this is where we put the name of the action that we're going to use. So GitHub themselves have an action. It's called actions checkout. And we need to specify the version. So we'll say @v2. And this is normally like a tag or a release on the action itself. That's all it takes to get code checked out into our Ubuntu server. So let me just quickly commit this up to GitHub here. And you can see the good old whip commit. Close this and go back over to the browser. So now if we head over to the Actions tab, you can see my commit here. And because I've said I want it to run on push, it's now started running that PHP unit suite workflow. So I'm just going to click into it here and click the step on the side here. And you can see each step that we've declared inside of that workflow. So that first one I called checkout code. You can see it here. I can click into it and all of the info is available. So you can see it's checking out this repository. It's setting all of that stuff up for us. So the next logical step would be getting PHP itself set up. So again, there's actions for most things out there, and the same goes for PHP. So let's call this install PHP. And again, we'll say users. But this time we're not going to be using one under the actions namespace. In fact, I'm going to copy and paste this over just so I get the spelling right. But we're going to be using a community action, and you can write your own actions. We won't cover this here. It's quite complex. You need to know some Node or some Docker, so we won't cover that here. But by using this action, PHP is going to be automatically set up on a server. It'll install the global binary as well as some other bits for us. If we head over to the browser, as you might know, Laravel actually requires some extensions to work properly. So you can find this on the docs. You can see we need the BC math, the C type, the JSON, the MB string extensions. So for safe measure, I'm actually just going to declare all of these inside of our workflow. The actions can take parameters, and you can pass those parameters in using the with key. And this is going to be an object or an array of options, which are defined with little hyphens. Sorry, not with hyphens, with keys. So in this case, we're going to say PHP version first. I don't know about you, but I test everything on the latest version, so 7.4 in this case. You can also put 8 here if you wanted to test on 8. You might need to add the RC flags though. Then we're also going to say what extensions we need. So I've got a list of them on my other screen. I'm just going to go over. Some of these do come with PHP out of the box, but I like to add them here just to be safe. So we're not going to commit yet. We're going to do a couple more things before we try and run our workflow again. The first thing we're going to do is actually install our composer dependencies. Now that we've got PHP set up and composer set up because of this action, we can actually define a new step. And let's just call this install composer dependencies. The difference here is that there's not actually an action that I normally use for this. Instead, I like to run the commands myself. So we can use a new key called run. And this just takes a string. So in this case, it will be composer install. And I'm going to say no interaction so that we don't have to do the yes or no that you might sometimes do. And I'm also going to say that we prefer the dist. So let's just do a quick whip commit again up to the repo and check out this action. So over to GitHub. And if we just go back over to actions here, we can see this run. So it live updates the UI. So you can see the workflow is running. And if we give it 2 seconds, let's take a sip of water quickly. So we checked out the code, we installed PHP, and now it's installing our composer dependencies. And we haven't had to say yes or no here. We said no interaction. And our workflow completed fine. If we just take a quick look here, you can see it downloaded all of the dependencies like it would on your local machine. And if we take a look at the install PHP step, all of the extensions have been installed and enabled. Okay, let's go back to VS Code then. So now that we've got Composer installed, what do we want to do next? Well, we probably want to actually run our test suite. So I'm going to create a step here, and I'm just going to call run test suite. And like I said, I'm going to be using PHP artisan test here instead of the generic PHP binary, just because it has that pretty UI. So now let's run PHP artisan test. You've seen locally that this works fine. But if we quickly, do a whip commit here, push up, see how it runs. Let's go back to actions, and you can see the commit here. Now let's go into it. We'll wait for the workflow to run. There's actually sort of a nuance with running PHP artisan test in CI. And hopefully we'll see this in a second after the composer dependencies have installed. But running locally, you wouldn't actually notice this problem due to how Laravel picks up environment variables. You can see the error here. Let me just open this back up. So our unit test passed fine. And that's because that unit test doesn't inherit from Laravel's test case. It actually uses the regular PHP unit one. So there's no Laravel framework bootstrapping going on. But our feature test uses Laravel's test case that comes out of the box with the boilerplate. And you can see that there's no application key set. The app_key variable that's normally in your env file, that hasn't been set. And the way I normally like to work around this is just by creating a new file in the root called .env.ci. And then this is a nice place to put all of your dynamic environment variables, because this is going to be created every time you run your test suite. So I'm going to leave this blank for now. But for Laravel to actually use this, we need to call it .env, not .env.ci. So let's go just above our test suite action here. And I'm just going to create a new step called setup environment. We're going to be running some Unix commands again here. So the first one is going to be copy. We're going to copy that .env.ci file to the .env path. And now Laravel will be able to see that file and it will use it as its base environment. The only thing now is, though, we need to generate that key. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this. You could use the Unix syntax. You could say PHP artisan key generate, like this. Or if you've got multiple commands, what you can actually do is use a pipe symbol here and then push these onto the next line. And all this pipe symbol means in YAML is it expects the bit of text underneath it that's been indented to be a string literal. And I'm going to make this a multi-line string in this case. So this is just a little bit easier to read. Let's try and push this up again. I'm going to use a whip commit again just for the speed. And if we head back over to GitHub Actions, we'd expect everything to pass fine. So let's just wait here. I'll take another sip of water. So here we go. We've installed PHP. We're going to be installing our composer dependencies. And this is all running fine still as it was before. And now you can see all of our tests are passing, our unit test and our feature test. And that's because the key has been set in that env file. And that's like the most basic GitHub Actions setup for a Laravel app. So again, we check out our code, we set up PHP with all of the extensions. If your application maybe uses the internationalization extension or perhaps the multi-threaded extension, then you can add that into the list here. We install our composer dependencies, we set up our environment, and we run our test suite. So I did mention that we were going to look at how we can get notified on Slack. So let's just take a look at that quickly. I'm going to go over to GitHub quickly because there's a little bit of base knowledge needed here. So you might have seen this before, but there's a secrets tab on the left-hand side here. And this is basically where you can put any secure or things you don't want to be public. So webhook URLs or SSH passwords. So I've got one here called Slack webhook URL. And I generated this on Slack. I created a new app in my workspace. And you can see I've got the workspace over here. I've created a channel specifically for GitHub Actions. So let's look at how we can ping this webhook URL. Let's go back over to VS Code. I'm going to create a new step here. And I'm just going to call this notify Slack. And this is going to use a community extension again. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in. 8398A7 is the author of this action. And you can see it's called Action Slack. And it's going to ping our webhook with some nice messaging and some nice formatting. And this is, again, quite easy to get set up. A new key, though, is the env key. And these are going to be environment variables that are set before this action runs. So let's take that Slack webhook URL and let's actually use our secret. So inside of our action, we have access to a secrets object, which will contain all of our secrets that we've defined in that settings page. So now I'm going to just whip commit again. Never get old whip commits. And if we run our actions one more time. Let's just wait for this to run. So we're setting up the job, installing PHP, installing Composer. And Composer's nearly installed. Setting up our environment. And you can see we're missing a key here. So this is the nice thing about GitHub Actions. It actually has quite good errors, quite easy to work with errors in most cases, especially if the author themselves of the action, the authors actually, supplied those really nice, easy to read errors. So input required and not supplied status. So this looks like that we're missing an argument down here. So let's use that syntax with that we were using earlier on. And it's saying that we need to use status. So let's pass this in. Now, just down below here, we used a secrets object. There is also another one called job. And this is just going to hold some information about the job that's currently running. So we're going to use the status key. So this will, say success or failure. So one last time, let's just whip commit again. There we go. And if we let this run, this is the tedious part of getting GitHub Actions set up at first, is having to wait for the actions to run and then, oh, there's a problem, so I need to run it again. So we're checking out code, installing PHP. And if we look further down, we can wait for some of these to set up. And our test suite's running, notify Slack has run. And now if I go back over to Slack, you can see I've just received this message. So succeeded GitHub Actions. It tells you what repo it is and also the commit that triggered the workflow. One nice touch that you can add is actually tell it what fields to add. So there's a field parameter or argument. And we can put a couple of different ones down here. So they're comma separated. So we can say the message, the action that's running, the workflow that's running, the job that's running, as well as how long it took. You'll find that some of these actually require other arguments. So in this case, let's say job name. And now this is going to match the name of the job at the very top. So up here, I called it run PHP unit suite. So let's just put that down here. And one other thing that I like to do is you can see it says the name of the action here. I don't really like that. I'd like it to say GitHub Actions. So there's an argument for that. You can call it author_name, passing GitHub Actions, and we'll do one more whip commit. We'll let that run in the background, and I'll come back and check that out in a second. The other thing that I wanted to cover quickly is you've noticed every time we run a workflow, our composer dependencies are being installed fresh. There's no cache, there's no memoization of those dependencies. So there is a way of working around this, and I'll cover this now quickly. I'm just going to create a new step above our composer dependencies, and I'll call it cache composer dependencies. And we're going to say what action it uses. Now, GitHub themselves also provide this action. It's actions/cache, and it's v2. And there are some arguments for this. So we're going to say what path do we want to cache, what folder, what files. In our case, it's composer. So we're going to say the vendor folder. And we're also going to give it a key. And now this key is going to be used to bust the cache. So in our case, we're going to be saying composer hyphen, which is what most people do. And there is a hash files function that GitHub provides inside of Actions. And this will basically hash a file based on the last modified time or the contents of the file. So let's just say composer.lock. Since the lock file is probably not going to change unless you've updated your dependencies. So I'm going to whip commit this one more time. Now, if we head back over to GitHub, you can see that last action we ran, it came through with GitHub Actions as the author instead of the name of the action. So let's go here and run PHP unit suite. We'll let this start up. So you can see the cache wasn't found for these input keys this time because it's the first time that it's being cached. So it's going to run through all of the installation, and then at the very end, it's going to run this cache job to, zip up that file and cache it for later on. So that was significantly quick in comparison to the other ones. You can see the message came through with our extra parameters. Now, the last thing that I actually want to cover here is conditionally running jobs. So let's say our Slack job, for instance, we might not want that to run on every single workflow that runs. We just fill up that channel with message after message. So GitHub Actions allows you to conditionally run actions using this if key. And they provide a few helpers, but the one we're going to be using in this case is failure. So we're only going to be notified on Slack about a failed job. So let's force a failure. Let's just go into this unit test, and instead of asserting true is true, let's assert that true is false, which is obviously going to fail. We can check this quickly locally. PHP odds and test. You can see one failed, and so now let's whip commit. This is the last whip commit, I promise. Go back to actions. Let's head into the action that's currently running, or the workflow that's currently running. We'll wait for it to boot up, and we'll be able to see the cache in action here. So we're setting up the job, installed in PHP. If we want to open up this one, you can see the cache was restored based on the key generated. The test suite has failed, but our notify Slack action is still running. We can go over to Slack, and we can see that the GitHub action has failed, the message, the job, the workflow. And you can click onto these as well. They will take you through to those other pages. So if I clicked here, it will take me through to that failure right there. And I mean, that's pretty much it. That's the most basic Laravel setup on GitHub Actions. Quite quick, but even in less than half an hour, I've spent much more time setting up CI/CD. I've spent probably whole days setting up CI/CD before. So this is super quick. There's lots of community actions out there. It's not hard to work with, and I've shown you that some of the areas can be easy to read as well. For people that are eager, I'm actually working on a course at the minute called GitHub Actions for PHP developers. The URL is on the screen there. It's actions-for-php.com. You can head over there, sign up for the newsletter. I'll be sending one out next week with some early access content. And I'll be going over these same concepts in a bit more depth. I'll be looking at different ways of debugging your workflows, how you can test them locally, and much, much more. So if you are interested in that, sign up for the newsletter, and I'll be sending an email out next week. I just want to say thanks for listening. I'm still new to this whole talk thing, so hopefully I didn't do too bad. Hopefully everything sounds all right and works all right. You can find me on Twitter. My handle's there. Follow me. I'm sure you'll find something useful on my feed. And I also have a blog. The URL is there. It's my Twitter handle, .co.uk. I write quite a few articles, probably three a month, 2 or 3 a month. So check that out as well. Let me know what you think on Twitter. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Cool, man. Thanks for that talk. I thought it was a very, very nice talk. I don't know if you see the chat, but there are lots of fires and clapping hands in the chat now. So, job well done, man. There's one question that I have. So you showed us this excellent workflow, and indeed you built up quite fast. Can people somewhere see that workflow, or just use it, the workflow that you just typed? That might be handy for some people.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'll after the meetup and Liam's talk, I'll make it public and I'll post it on my Twitter, so everyone can see it. And I'll add some instructions there as well about specific things like the Slack stuff and whatnot. But
cool.
Yeah, no,
cool.
definitely, 100%.
Cool, perfect, man. Thanks you so much for coming on the stream again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Bye, man.
Cheers, bye.
Okay, that was the first part of the meetup. We'll be back in 5 minutes with Liam. So yeah, see you in 5. I should get myself off the stream before anybody creates a meme of me. Okay, here we are back, and I hope that you enjoyed that little break. If everything is well, I have here the second guest for this evening. It's Liam Hammett. Hello, good evening, man. I think you're still muted, so I think you need to unmute your
There we go.
microphone. Yeah, that's much better. Hey, man, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Well, good. Thanks. How about you?
Nice. I had a pretty good day, so that's cool. And I've been looking forward to this meetup, and also to your talk, because your talk is on one of the more basic things of PHP where people don't get in touch much these days. Auto loading.
Yeah, it's something that's kind of abstracted away since Composer came around a few years ago.
Yeah, indeed.
People don't really know about it nowadays, I don't think, but you can do a lot with it. So
yeah,
wanted to sort of bring it up.
I still remember the pre-composer days where I had to write my own autoloader, so I remember the pain a little bit.
Yeah.
But you're probably not going to talk about painful bits, but about awesome things you can do.
Hopefully it's not too painful. But...
Okay, cool. I'll add your screen to the stream, and then you can take it away. Yes.
Okay, cool. So, hi, if you don't know me, my name is Liam Hammett. I do a lot of random things with PHP, particularly in the Laravel ecosystem. Like Ryan mentioned earlier, I've done stuff like the tool preset for Laravel and Alpine. But today I'm going to be talking about something that I think is an interesting topic, which is autoloaders and using them in a few unconventional, maybe wacky ways that you probably haven't thought of to give us some new ways that we can write our own code. So if you're not familiar with what an autoloader is, then let's just quickly recap what they are and how they're commonly used. If you try to use a class in PHP, PHP might not actually know what that class is because it's not loaded the file that defines it yet. So PHP actually gives us this useful little SPL autoload register function, and that lets us hook into that event. So when PHP doesn't know what a class is, instead of throwing an error, it lets us run some custom logic to try and load it. So this is the simplest possible autoloader you could write. And so when we try to load a user class, it'll actually try and load the user.php file and require that. And that user.php file should define the user class. But autoloading can get kind of complicated. And if you're loading things from lots of different directories, using namespaces, maybe including third-party packages, then the code is going to be a lot more complicated than this. So the PHP community came up with a couple of standards that we can use to sort of consistently autoload files across lots of different projects. We initially started off with PSR0, which was a pretty simple standard, but it was deprecated and replaced with PSR4 soon after, which is what we pretty much all use nowadays. And notably, the PHP Fig website, so the people that wrote these standards actually have a couple of example implementations on their website. So you can just go there and see exactly what you need to do to load to autoload code to meet those standards. And there's a couple more complex examples there as well, if you need to load in multiple namespaces or do more things. But realistically, who does that themselves to load files? I know I don't. Instead, I use Composer. And odds are, if you've only been writing PHP for the last 7 or 8 years before Composer was around, since Composer's been around, then you've only ever used it to autoload stuff. Composer handles the PSR0 and PSR4 autoloading for us, as well as a whole bunch of other things like including class maps or specific files, all while handling our vendor dependencies. And Composer's autoloader is great. So when I talk about using custom autoloader, I don't mean that we should replace Composer with something else. Instead, you can actually have more than one autoloader at a time, which you might not have known. So you can do extra stuff on top of Composer's autoloader, or even before Composer started to try and find a file. And autoloaders are typically meant to load files, but that's not actually what they have to do. We can do whatever custom code we want. And that's great because autoloaders kind of give us a way to look into every single piece of code that we're going to run in our project. Every single file that we open is going to go through this piece of code. So we can run whatever custom logic we want there. So I want to start off with a simple example that I think is probably the best example of how autoloaders work and how we can make use of them, and that's static constructors. So you might not be familiar with static constructors because although it's a thing that lots of different object-oriented languages have, PHP doesn't really have first-class support for it. So if you're not familiar with the concept, a static constructor is basically just a function that you can define on a class, which can be used to do whatever you want, like initialize static properties or perform actions that only need to be performed once for that class. So let's take a look at something this could help solve. Here we've got a simple class that can just get a list of countries by reading them from a JSON file. It's pretty straightforward, but it has a big problem. Every time we want to get that list of countries, it's going to read and decode that JSON file, which can be a pretty slow operation, especially if we do it a lot. So instead, you might think we might use a technique like memoization so that we only read the file once. Now with this updated code, it'll only read the file once and save those results to a property, meaning that we can call this function as many times as we want and it won't affect the performance like it would have before. But this approach still forces us to go through a getter function instead of accessing the property directly, which is kind of fine, and it's a pretty common pattern that we've accepted in PHP. But let's take a look at what it might look like if we do this with static constructors instead. But just before we do that, let's see what a static constructor actually is and the rules it needs to follow. So a static constructor, like we said before, is a static function that belongs to a class, but it should take no parameters. It should only ever be called once for that class. It's executed before any instances of the class are created, so before we hit the normal constructor. It's executed before any static properties are referenced, and before any other static methods are called. So really, it's kind of a simple function with nothing special about it. We just need to make sure that it gets called at the right time. So here we've changed it up. So we've defined a function called construct static, just to sort of follow the naming conventions of PHP's regular magic methods. But there's nothing magic about this one yet. All it does is load a file into the property exactly as we did before. So how can we make sure this function actually gets called before we try to access anything on it? You might think it's kind of hard to build something that meets all those rules, right? But it's really not. All we have to do is call it in the same file that the class is defined. And that's basically it. This means that as soon as we try to reference this country's class somewhere else in our code base, Composer is going to autoload this file for us, which will define the class and then execute the function straight after. And this is such a simple and straightforward pattern, but it can give you a whole new way to hook into classes and do some logic of your own. And it's not really just limited to initializing properties either. This was a pretty bad example, but let's take a look at another one. Here we've got a straightforward Laravel controller that returns a view, but we don't really care about what the controller does in this case. But how do we know what URL should map to this controller? Typically, we'd have that defined in our root/web.php file, where we'd list out all our routes and link them to our controllers, which is pretty nice for some situations because you've got this one file that you can go to see where all of your routes are defined, and you can use that to track how your application's being processed. But let's take it out of there and see what it's like if we put that in a static constructor instead. So by defining the route in a static constructor, now the route's part of the class. All the logic is grouped together in this one file instead of being split out across multiple files. And this is just one example of how we might use it, but you can use plenty of other things here, like registering middlewares for the controller or pre-processing the request or doing whatever else you need to do. And there's actually one more important thing to note about this, is that the static constructor won't actually be executed like this because we're not hitting the controller by default. So we need to do something to autoload the controller file before the static constructor gets hit and then the route gets registered. So one naive way we might do this is by having some logic that finds all the files in our controllers directory and iterating over them one by one to require them. So we don't really care about the logic here, but this is just an example. We could actually do a lot better than this if we take into account things like opcache and preloading. So there are better solutions out there, but they can get more complex. I'm not going to show them here. So that kind of solves all our problems. But now, you remember that little call to construct static at the end of every file that we've defined? That might get a little bit tiresome and repetitive and really easy to forget if you're not paying close attention. So wouldn't it be cool if we could instead just remove that line entirely and have it trigger automatically like a real magic method would? Well, we can actually write an autoloader to do it for us. So here we're going to require Composer's own autoloader and then define our own custom one after it that will run after Composer's done. So since Composer should have already loaded the file at this point, we can just check if the class exists, making sure we don't trigger autoloading ourselves by setting the autoload property to false, because we don't want to get into a recursive loop where we just try and call the autoloader again to check if the class exists. And if we know that the class actually exists, then we can just check if the class has a construct static method. And if it does, we can just call it. And now that's kind of solved our problem. We don't have to have that line at the bottom of all of our controllers because it's called automatically as soon as we try to autoload a file. But there's a little bit of a disclaimer here. This won't actually work one-to-one. So as soon as Composer successfully autoloaded a file, it will stop calling the other autoloaders in the stack and just return because it's successfully loaded the file, which is what it's meant to do. So how can we actually run this code after Composer successfully autoloaded a file? Composer doesn't really give us a nice event or hook to use for this kind of thing, so we need to think a little bit more outside the box. And instead, we're going to try completely overriding Composer's own autoloader and replacing it with our own. So if you didn't know, when you require Composer's autoload.php file, it actually returns an instance of that autoloader class with it. So we can take that and assign it to a variable for us to reuse later on. And that class actually has an unregister method on it. So Composer automatically registers itself as an autoloader, but we can unregister it to stop it doing its own thing. But at this point, it's important to note that we still have the autoloader class as a variable, so we can still call things on it later on. So when we define our own custom autoloader, we're going to use that autoloader class that Composer's given us, and we can just call the load class function on that, which is exactly what Composer does normally to load a class. But the caveat, or not the caveat, the thing here is that now we get the result of that, and we can see if it's true, it's actually successfully returned, it's successfully autoloaded a class. So we can run our own custom logic here. So we can just move that check exactly here so that it will do the same thing as we did before, but it will still be using Composer under the hood. And now Composer will continue to autoload files exactly as it would do. You wouldn't see any difference there, but it'll also execute any static constructors along the way. So now in any of our files that we've called this construct static function, we can just completely get rid of it because Composer and the autoloader will do it for us. I think that's a pretty great start, but let's take this a little step further again and follow on from what we've done with the static constructors and use them to enrich our application with something that's coming in PHP 8, which is coming out in a month now, I think, which is class attributes. So we've got the same controller here. We don't really care what it does, but we need to know what root maps to the controller. So here we can actually define a root at the an attribute at the top of the class file. And this attribute is basically meant to be a replacement for a lot of doc block comments that we had in previous versions of PHP, but they're actually a lot more powerful because they're a first-party feature of the language now. So they can actually map to a real class that contains logic. So let's see what this root class might look like. It's a pretty straightforward class to start off. All it's doing is accepting the method and the root that we passed into it, and then saving them as properties so we can reuse them later. But there's one pretty meta thing going on here. There's actually an attribute called attribute defined on this class, which is what turns this into an attribute. So let's see how we can make use of this. We're going back to the same kind of autoloader that we had before to run after Composer's done something. But now, when it's successfully autoloaded a class, we can use the reflection class function to get any attributes off of that class. We can then iterate over those attributes until we find our own root attribute. And if we do it, we can create a new instance of it. And the important thing to note here is that the new instance method will actually create it with the arguments that we passed in the controller file when we used the root. So at this point, we already know exactly what the method and the URL is that the root should have. But it's not really doing anything right now. So back in the root attribute, we're going to add a new register method to the attribute class, which will do all of the work that we want. And this is just going to call the root facade that Laravel provides. So exactly like we normally would, we would then define the method. We would define the root with the method and the URL that we want. But then we can pass through the controller that we get from the autoloading to sort of finish it off and give us everything that we want. So back in our autoloader, we can just call the register method on that root, and now we're done. That's all we really need to do. And now we're making use of roots. And with just a few lines of code in an autoloader and making a custom attribute, we've introduced a whole new way that we can set up routing for our application, that might appeal to you. This is something that lots of other frameworks and languages do, but PHP wasn't really capable of until now. And again, this isn't the only thing that attributes can be used for. You can do it for whatever kind of logic you think fits. You might use it for registering a middleware, or something like Doctrine might be able to use attributes like this to automatically define what columns are in the database and how they map to the model. And I'm sure we're going to see lots of really interesting uses of them as the adoption of PHP 8 sort of rises over the coming months as it gets released. But they were some pretty simple things, really. I want to take this a step further and see what we can do with real-time classes. And I think this is a super interesting subject because this is just a really powerful way to make stuff happen with an autoloader, because it means that the class is generated in real time, completely on the fly, even if it didn't exist before. And even more interestingly, this is already used all over the place in production applications because this is something that Laravel provides out of the box with real-time facades. So let's build that out to see how it works and see what a regular facade is to start off. So here we've got a pretty basic class to send an email. It lets us set who the email is going to, what the subject line should be, and what the body of the email is. And then there's also a method to send it once we've supplied all that information. So when we use that class, we need to make a new instance of it, and then we can chain any methods off of it in whatever order we want. So the thing that the facade class will do is actually it'll prevent us from having to create a new instance of it. And it does this by being its own class that just defines a magic call static method. And that's a magic method that PHP provides, because if we try to call any magic method on this email facade class that doesn't really exist, it will go through this function instead. So as you can see here, we're just doing exactly what we did before. We're creating a new email object, and then we're calling a method off of that and passing through the arguments, just like we normally would. And now when we want to send an email, we can use the facade. And we don't have to create a new instance of it first. We can call any of these arguments in whatever order we want, apart from the send function at the end. And now Laravel's facades actually has a lot more than this to it. It does stuff to automatically register, to automatically pull things from the service container, and to make testing of these classes really easy. But this is a good enough example for our own case. But we don't really want to have to write out these new facade classes every single time we want to do something like this. So how can an autoloader help? Well, the SPL autoload register function actually accepts a couple of extra parameters to the autoloader. So notably, it gives us the option to prepend our autoload function to the start of the autoloading stack. So if we set that to true, it means that this autoload function will actually be executed before Composer's own autoloader. So we can override the default behavior to find a class before Composer even gets a chance to look at it. And by the way, this is actually valid syntax in PHP 8 with the new named arguments, which I think is pretty cool. So what if we can use this to write a facade class on the fly in real time? We're going to go with the same convention that Laravel has here now. So if we try to load a class whose namespace starts with facades, we'll assume it's a real-time facade and we'll run our own custom logic. We're also going to make a new facades directory to put these files in at the given path. We're going to make sure to hash the class name with SHA-1 just to deal with any special characters that might be in there. And now that we know what the path is going to be for the file, the first thing we can do is just check if it already exists. And if it does, then we can require it and return true so we don't call the next autoloader in the chain. But if it doesn't exist, we need to make it. So firstly, we'll make sure the facades directory exists, and then we'll use the touch function to create a new empty file. And next, we actually need to write the facade code to the file that we've created. So to prepare for that, we'll need to figure out what the real class name and the namespace are, since we'll need to reference them inside the file. And then to write the actual PHP class to the file, it's kind of stupidly simple, really. We just need to put the raw code in there. We can have that raw code as a string in line, and then just pipe that through the file put contents function to write it to that empty file that we've already made. And doing so, we can also interpolate the original class base name and the original namespace that we had so that it can create an instance of the correct class. And then all we have to do now that we've written that file is require it and return true again, just so that we don't call the next autoloader in the chain. And it's kind of really that simple. Now that's done, this is what our final code might look like. We'll require our autoloader and then call the functions. call the facades with the functions in whatever order we want, even if those functions aren't static methods on the original email class. And here we can see what the folder structure is like as well. The facades directory contains a file named with the SHA-1 hash that we gave it. And this is now going to automatically work with any class so long as we import it from the facades namespace. And you're probably thinking, won't this slow down our code base a lot if it's got to stop and create new files all the time? But realistically, it doesn't, because it only has to do it once for each time. Plus, as soon as it's done it, that file will be an op cache. So it's not going to be any slower than any other file. But surely these facade files are going to clutter the Git repository. But again, they don't really have to, because you can completely ignore them from Git, because your production server can just generate these files on the fly when it needs them. And again, this is just a small convenience in this example, but you could take this to extreme lengths. And Laravel already does a lot more stuff than just this with it. And if you wanted to look at how Laravel actually does it and what it does differently, you can actually look in the alias loader class in the framework, because that's the class that handles all of the real-time facade loading. But now I want to take real-time classes to the extreme and talk about pre-processing. You're probably familiar with pre-processing with things like Sass and Less, which compile to CSS, or maybe even with Babel, which lets you take JavaScript and sort of automatically rewrite it so that it'll work in any browser. But what you might not know is that you can actually do this with PHP as well on the back end. So there's a tool from Christopher Pitt called Pre, and I think its tagline speaks for itself. It gives you syntax that you like that runs where you need. So essentially, this is a composer package that makes use of a custom autoloader that will pre-process your source code so that you can write PHP with Pre's custom syntax. And Pre will take that and rewrite it to a plain PHP file as soon as you try to load it. Kind of like how our real-time classes worked before, but just to a much more extreme level. And Pre's already supported a lot of things in the past that we've eventually got in PHP's core, like allowing trailing commas and list of function arguments and being able to use short closures. But it can give us so many more ways that we can write code. And I just want to go over some quick examples of plugins that it's got available. Simple one is, it lets you dynamically set values directly in properties. Like if you want to set the default value of a property to be the result of a function call, or maybe a new object, it lets you do that. And it also lets you do the same in function arguments. There's also a plugin that lets you write HTML inline inside your PHP code, just like you're probably used to with React and JSX on the front end. It also has a plugin that gives you the async await keyword to write asynchronous operations like you're used to in JavaScript. There's also a way that you can write custom collections, just like we're used to with the collect helper in Laravel. Just a nicer syntax to give us a way to write arrays with extra functionality. There's also a plugin that gives you the defer keyword, which lets you defer a line of code until the end of the current block. So if you open a file, you can immediately defer the closing of it. And that means the file won't be closed immediately, but it will be closed as soon as that full block of code has been run, which means that you can sort of keep these important bits of logic together instead of having like 50 other lines of code in between them. But probably my favorite thing is generics. And this is something where you can add a type hint where the type can actually be different depending on what you use when you create the class. And then that type can actually be resolved at runtime. So as you can see, there's a lot of features like this that I'm sure we'd all absolutely love to have in PHP today. And tools like Pre make it possible to write the source code. So I really recommend just going to the Pre repository on GitHub and giving it some love if you're interested in this, because I really think it could change the shape of the PHP landscape if enough people care about it. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully it's made you think about how powerful PHP can be as a language even today, and how you might be able to get some more future-like syntax and tools out of it that can help you improve your own applications. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Liam Hammett, or check out my site where I occasionally talk about doing some wacky stuff with PHP like this. There's a link to the slides at the bottom if you want to copy and paste some of the code from it, but I'll make sure to tweet out a link later as well. Thanks to Freek and everyone else for having me.
Cool, man. Thanks for your talk. That was pretty great. I'm pretty sure people don't appreciate what's going behind the scenes when autoloading stuff. People just think, hey, this just works, but there's actually a lot a lot of things that can happen. I got
Yeah.
one question for you from Nuno. Would you like to see like auto-loading functions in PHP, because that's now missing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I don't use functions in PHP a lot, because there's just no way to autoload a function in a nice way.
Yeah, and if you want to use a function, it's basically polluting like the global namespace unless you have to import it. But yeah, auto-loading there would be great, I think, as well. Okay, Liam.
Agree.
Thank you so much for your talk and coming on. I hope that you liked it yourself.
Certainly did. Thanks for having me.
All right, cool. Bye, man. Okay, that is the end of the meetup. Before leaving you, let's see where I have put it. Here. I haven't decided on a next date for the next meetup yet. So you'll have to keep an eye out for it on these two resources. So the first one is the Twitter account of this meetup. I'll post updates there. And the second is, of course, the website itself. I also post the schedule there well ahead of time. On that site, you can also submit a talk that you'd like to give at this meetup. So our aim for this meetup is to like discover new speakers and speakers that aren't that well known or haven't got a chance to talk at one of the Laracons yet. And so any length of talk is allowed. It's a maximum of 30 minutes, and any level is allowed. So if you got a talk idea, submit it on our website. And yeah, with that being said, I'm going to try to shut this down without you having a chance creating a meme out of me. So let's hope that it works this time. And I'll probably see you back at the end of next month. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for watching.